It is so good to be with you all today, whether you're here gathered in All Saints Hall or you happen to be joining us online. My name is Joshua Case, and it is my honor to host this conversation this morning with Gary Gunderson and with Suzanne Henderson. I want to do a little bit of a couple of intros here. Gary, welcome. Glad you're here. Suzanne, glad you're here. Suzanne really doesn't need a lot of introduction. As you all know, she's our scholar in residence, but I found a fun bio of Suzanne that she didn't even know that I found, and I thought I would share that because Suzanne's work is more than just that of a New Testament scholar and more than just that of a scholar in residence for us. Suzanne, as you know, was ordained a disciples minister. She is a New Testament scholar and has spent the last 2 decades in higher education, serving as a professor and dean of the chapel and leading efforts to embed religious pluralism across campus life all over the U.S. She presently is leading Interfaith America's growing exploration at the intersection of faith and health. And this is part of her bio that I thought would be very interesting for us. Despite her doctorate from Duke, Suzanne's basketball loyalties lie with UNC, where she, with Chapel Hill, where she received her BA. So I thought that would be good. But it's also just my honor to welcome Gary Gunderson to be with us. Gary, for more than 2 decades, has been at the leading edge of creative work in the field of faith and public health. He initially began this work at the Carter Center and at the Emory School of Public Health, and then in Memphis, Tennessee, where his ideas around the leading causes of life found movement through more than 600 congregational partners, showing hard evidence of improved outcomes, including mortality, cost, and dramatically lowering hospitalization rates in the communities that were involved. As Vice President for Faith Health at Wake Forest, Gary leads a division which includes spiritual care and clinical pastoral education, 37 counseling centers, and a highly innovative ground game focused on vulnerable communities all across the state. Gary, welcome, and we are so thankful that you're here with us today. So, as you all know, we've started a conversation this winter around the theme of the abundant life. And one of the things that we continue to explore is the way in which faith and connection and well-being play a role not only in the lives of individuals, but also in the lives of entire communities. And there's a sense with which this conversation that we started a few weeks ago and that we will continue to have is one about the way in which the abundance of God can be known not only in the life of an individual, but almost especially in the life of an individual as they explore what it means to be in community, small community, maybe community within the parish that they are a part of, but also as they begin to take stock of and understand what abundance means in their connection to the broader community of the cities and the communities in which they are a part of. Gary, in your work, you've come to describe the need to focus community work on this theme around leading causes of life. I wonder if you would say something to us just a little bit about leading causes of life and talk a little bit about how faith is an indicator in that way.
So my experience with public health, although I'm a professor of it, I didn't come up through the normal academic way. And I actually came into public health one day when Jimmy Carter and Bill Foege, who had been head of the Centers for Disease Control under President Carter, called me into their office and said they'd gotten a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation about faith and health, and they wanted me to lead that thing. And he said, I remember Bill Foege said, well, it's really faith in public health. I said, well, Bill, I don't know anything about public health. He said, you'll pick it up in no time. It's the head of the CDC. And so I said, I'm a Baptist, so let me see if I can borrow the pulpit Sunday. And if I can preach a public health sermon, I'll do it. And I started looking into this. And essentially, public health is the science of the people that God so loves. It's about the whole of the people, all of the people that God so loves. And it's overwhelmingly about the life of the people. Well, public health as a field mostly designs its budgets and programs around the leading causes of death. And at one point, working there, I said, surely, good God Almighty, I'm just so sick of one more cause of death. Surely there's causes of life. And as soon as the question, sparkled into my head, that is a damn good question. And essentially, for 25 years, that's the question I've lived with. And it turns out you can have the same sort of programmatic precision and logic and thoughtfulness about building around the causes of life in much the way you can around causes of death. They're just opposite kind of list, different kind of thing. You look for more life, whereas you look for less death. You look for the sources of generative emergence, not things that are trying to get us. Obviously, you need both. I mean, we're in a city of extraordinary medical capacity, but we often forget that we're in a city of extraordinary life. And I think if we would focus on the causes of life, they're really just five. Connection, what we're doing here, coherence, this sort of deep sense in your gut that there's a story that we're part of. It's not the list of things we believe, it's a deep sense of that we're part of a great story. Sense of agency, that we're not victims, we're not just patients, we're not just clients of somebody else's expertise. We're agents in our own life, and we have extraordinary agency when we're gathered together as God's people. Blessing, sense that we're in a flow of blessing, and parents experience this when you are most alive, when you're letting life flow through you in a generous manner to your kids, and the church is most alive when it experiences the blessings of God flowing through them, overflowing in abundance into the community. And the last is hope. And that's by far the best documented in every possible discipline's literature. But it's not just hope for me, it's hope for all the people that God so loves.
Will you say a little bit more about how hope shows up and how hope is a leading indicator of life?
So when I started writing this, hope was so obvious. And a friend of mine at University of Massachusetts guided me towards the literature. If you Google the phrase, like a good academic would, the fascinating phrase is a memory of the future. And humans, are guided by our expectations of the future that are as vivid as memory is for most other mammals. So if you've got a dog, a dog has got a really good memory. So the brown shoes mean you're going out, the black shoes mean, we're going for a walk. But they also make their decisions out of their memory. And humans have the capacity to make decisions based on hope, expectation. And it is so powerful that it turns into biology. One of the most powerful drugs any physician has is the placebo, because it takes expectation and turns it into biology and chemistry. So, but it's important that the hope is the hope for the things that matter most to your life. So when my mom was in her last year or two, and she was mom. She knew what was going on, and she was very realistic. She knew not to be optimistic about her longevity at that point, but she was hopeful and healthy because she was confident that the things that mattered most to her life, that she'd invested her life in, were well. And so there was a sense of peace, even as she knew she was in the process of dying. She was also a little bit of a control freak, so she edited okay, you're the preacher. You're going to do the eulogy. What are you going to say? And let's work on that. But you could sense even in those words, she wanted her story told about what mattered most to her life.
Yeah. Well, so hope is one of those amazing things. Say a little bit about connection. We talked a little bit about connection last night, and I think one of the things that you kept surfacing in some of our conversations was the way in which connection it's really the sort of lifeblood of how life gets into us and gets into the world.
So a friend who wrote the book Leading Causes of Life with me was Larry Prey, a pastor of a tiny church in Big Timber, Montana. And he said if you only had one cause of life, it'd be connection, and it would actually be enough. Everything else comes from that. But the connection is not the names that we're taught about connection, and so it's not the nuclear family. It's not the names of it. It's the extraordinarily rich and complex relationships that turns out humans are perfectly adapted for chaotic connection, for really complex connection. Mm-hmm. And that's where our life flows through those complexities. So it's more like a couple hundred related people struggling across the savannah looking for mammals that are trying to eat them. And every now and then, the mammals eat somebody that you loved, but we're adapted as a species to live in the complexity that's in this room today. Many of the relationships don't have names or vocabulary, but life flows through those relationships, and we are most alive when we're living into the complexity. And in a church, when you're thinking, what's the greatest power that the church has? It's a place that every week, sometimes more than once a week, sometimes maybe just at Christmas and Easter, people who you have no relationship to by blood or job or obligation or legal tie in any way come together, and they create a complex whole. And if you need food, you can somehow find it across that complexity. If you need a kind word, if you need a babysitter, if you need a job, almost everything that matters in life comes across these complex relationships. And the more the church, stirs the complexity of those relationships, so the complexity can be transparent to each other. Some of the things that include stuff that are bruises that we're not proud of, that we're sort of embarrassed about. The more you can create a complex, trusting whole, that's the most powerful thing the society needs.
Suzanne, last week you led a class where you talked about Paul, and you talked about new creation and a sense of abundance. And we know Paul was a complex person who was writing letters to a lot of different communities that were in a lot of different places. Say a little bit about how you think Paul's journey and his vision for new creation speaks to this sense of connection and of hope that we as Christians have.
Yeah, no, I think there's rich resonance here. Some of you were with us last week. We spoke about how Paul would have held the view as a good Jew that this was the present evil age and that there was plenty of evidence around leading causes of death in his world, in Jesus' world. And yet when he became convinced that this Jewish rabbi from Palestine was the Messiah, he also became convinced that God was at work, that God's Spirit was loose in the world to unleash the leading causes of life and to equip folks to tap into that. And so Paul's invitation to each and every community that he founded and that he would continue to be in complex relationship with, was to live as if they were citizens of God's kingdom, not of Rome, right? And so they were to live as if in, he had that triad of faith, hope, and love, right? So there's all kinds of linguistic and theological overlap here. There's a sense in which Paul's vision for new creation and its implications for both personal and corporate and shared and communal life are just, the kinds of things that are showing up in the research today. So, yeah, our faith offers this too. It's a deep tradition that knew the wisdom that our scientists can now confirm. Who knew?
Yeah, who knew, right? Who knew? Gary, I'd love for you to say a little bit about your work in Memphis, because for people who are data geeks out there, your story about being called to the table about whether or not this leading causes of life stuff could actually work, I think bears out in Memphis in the way that you, as a person of faith and as an eternal optimist about what can happen with faith and health, really bears out in that story. Say a little bit about the invitation to do that, and I know you could spend all day talking about it, but give us a little bit of that story.
So we learned last night we have a dear friend in common.
We do.
Ted Carve, who literally the week before I moved to Memphis was with me in Johannesburg, South Africa, signing an agreement with the World Health Organization to research religious health assets. And when he was had a partnership for WHO at the time, and all the governments had basically been broken by this overwhelming pandemic, that this was before there were treatments of any kind. And he called me up on the phone and said, Gary, do you religious people actually have anything or not? He was Episcopal priest. So
Classic Ted question.
Yeah, a little bit of a disingenuous question. But what he was really asking was, can you make the assets of faith communities that are on the ground in African communities visible so that we can plan with them and actually be systematic? So we ended up doing this research in 2 countries. It was research, but activist research, trying to build these webs at the scale of countries in Zambia, it's much larger than Texas, and Sesotho, which is high, very, very high mountainous country. And so we did work in Memphis at the identical time using the identical sort of inquiry to see whether we could see the same things, because I was just moving to Memphis. I didn't know any more about Memphis than I did about Zambia. So we used the identical discovery process that was looking for the assets of faith, and they were connectional. And we knew it wasn't the hospital, it wasn't the clinical assets, it was the assets of the faith communities as they actually are on the ground. We learned, as soon as we started doing this in Lesotho, we learned right away that in the normal language of Lesotho, Sesotho, if you ask about faith, there's no possibility in the language to ask a question about health that's separate from faith. Every word for faith includes every description of health. Every word for health automatically includes faith. And that's like so smart. Like, how did we not know that? And so the villagers and the people on the tough streets in Memphis felt a little sorry for us that we didn't, those of us coming from medical and academic roles, didn't know the most fundamental thing about life is that it's impossible to separate what we were trying to connect. And I think that is profound. And so every single aspect, every single part of this building that's called a church, every single part of this is a health facility. And if you go over to the hospitals, I promise you, every single person working in that building also is a provider of faith and hope and compassion, or they should be fired because there is malpractice. Well, it's malpractice in this building to not be to not be smart and intentional and thoughtful about the way everything we do of faith actually supports, strengthens, nurtures the emergent life that God has put into us. We don't have to connect them. They're already there.
Mm-hmm. So say a little bit more about what happened in Memphis as you began to bring to life that network of faith health.
So as usual, it was the opposite of what I promised. I said, well, gee, if you connect hundreds of congregations in Memphis with a humble-spirited medical center, you're going to get a profound wealth of aftercare. So after the doc's done what they can do, the congregation will be there to provide, and we'll see lower length of stay and all sorts of benefits that come from it. Turned out we didn't see like 10 minutes decline of length of stay, but we saw a profound difference in creating a web of trust with hundreds of congregations that had lots of reasons to not trust the medical system. These were mostly African American congregations, so they knew that they knew. But we were able to create a web of trust, and it turned out the data moved quite profoundly because people came slightly better, slightly at the right time. So if you have diabetes, a week or two doesn't make a big difference. If you got sickle cell, like an hour and a half makes a really big difference. So come at the right time, come to the right door, primarily not the ED, so come to get in range of a doctor or a PA as soon as you can. Come ready to be treated, which primarily meant not scared to death and expecting to be disrespected. But come ready. Bring your bag of pills, and finally, come not alone. And so there wasn't a handoff from the congregations. Our promise was you would never be disconnected from the people who love you more than we do. So we'll do the medical thing, but we'll never disconnect you from the people that love you. And then, we hardwired all that. Well, that mechanical work of connecting what normally is radically disconnected and filled with friction made profound differences, including cost. People who come less anxious and come ready and come at the right time, much cheaper, they get better outcomes. And we saw in the data, part of the radical thing is dramatic changes in the length between the next time we saw somebody. And so most medical conditions aren't going to be fixed. There's cycles of care, and we saw that people who came in those conditions were able to stay out of the medical environment, but inside their loving environment with some competence in that. So we had tons of training going on. That was the real effect, but it was a trust effect. The hospital did nothing different clinically. It was 100% activating really the life system of the community.
So we are certainly in a wellness moment as a culture and society. We hear people talk often. I talk often when I talk about my well-being, about the team or the people that I have around me that I go to. I know who my doctor is. I know who my therapist is. I know who my spiritual director is. I know who my golf coach is. Yes, I have to have a golf coach too, for those of you that are wondering. And in some way, each of these people, they participate in my sort of understanding of how I'm coming to faith and how I'm coming to sort of be alive sort of in the world. I've heard you say a few different times that we're in kind of a moment of crisis right now in the world as it relates to this theme of wellness and well-being, and that it's a theological moment. It's a theological moment where we really need to be clear and straight about what we mean by wellness and well-being. I wonder if you'd say a little bit about this notion of wellness and what it means to be well.
Well, we're made for life, and we're made for life by a God who loves us and a God who loves everything else too. So wellness is a measure of our relationship, not our data. It's really not a description of all the data points that are like inside this bag of skin, that called Gary. Wellness is the name of the relationship. When I am in right relationship, you could say just relationship, righteous relationship. So our religious language has so much more bandwidth and so much more resonance than medical language does. And all the different disciplines, including your golf coach, who sort of have their own way of describing how you're coming along in the thing called your life. The best measure of the thing called your life is what is someone who you have helped call you? What's the name of that? And I remember the one time saying that God has given to the poor the power to name us correctly. And so we can name ourselves Christ Church. I wonder what the poor would call it. I don't know, Rich Person's Church, or they'll have some other name for you. But the poor accurately describe us, probably in the language that Jesus would say. And they would describe us in a way that would describe our well-being, our wellness, how much flows through these people. So the test in the New Testament, I'm hoping for a scholarly footnote, is see how they love one another. And see how they love the whole of God's creation. So our well-being is measured by what flows through. It's not our lipid, it's not our cortisol, it's not all that stuff. Do we live in a way that life flows through us? And it turns out the more that flows through, the more sticks, and we find our well-being. Probably would even help smooth out your golf stroke.
Yeah. Suzanne, say a little bit about righteousness.
Oh, we had this great exchange at dinner last night. Bob and I had a professor in seminary who was brilliant and also just very, very astute. And he talked about the meaning of righteousness in the Greek as he likened it to when he was a hippie living in a commune in Berkeley in the 60s, and you would come home with a righteous bag of groceries. So righteousness, I think has taken on this connotation in our culture of like prudish or something. But the real sense of it is just this abundance, this overflowing, this flowing through, right? There's a dynamism and a life spirit involved in that language.
Yeah. And it's not even just it's never just for us.
Right.
It is always, I think one of the myths of connection and one of the myths of the world in which we live is that we may live in certain areas, or we may live with certain connections that we feel or that we experience, or that are more explicit for us. But what's true, and I think COVID showed this to us, is that there are always invisible connections that exist, even for brief 15-minute intervals with each other, that we may not even ever, that we may never even sort of recognize, right? I Contain Multitudes is a book that recently came out that's about microbiomes and the way in which we are, read it if you'd like to. It's a really interesting book. It kind of freaked me out a little bit because it told me that every time I walk into a room, I'm emitting like millions and billions of microbiomes into the room with other people, and you're also doing the same thing for me, right? So whether we realize it or not, we're always having this exchange at a biological level with one another in all the places that we go. And I think for me, that's both really daunting, but also a beautiful picture of the way in which our lives are constantly overlapping with one another. And this sort of notion that faith health is a singular concept and unavoidable, I think is a really powerful thing for us to imagine in every room that we walk into, in every zoom up above and look at the concentric circles that sort of exist out and among the various places within which we travel.
Yeah, I think science is our friend here. And the radical way in which we are interconnected, some of the religious language of spirit as breath, well, as you just described, breath is not just energy. it carries our essence with it. And so when you're in a place filled with the Spirit, you're actually mingling the essence of everybody in that space. Now, biologically, we're sort of taught to that is really creepy. But it's an accurate description of what's going on even at the physical level, and how much more is going on at the spiritual level and social level, in which this space in between everybody here isn't empty. It's not 18 inches of empty space in between each of us. It's actually filled with all of the humanity that is in some ways more alive in that in-between space than inside my skin. That's where life is happening. It's relational, it's power, it's energy. And it is literally biologically accurate that we are a body. It's not a theological metaphor. It's actually biologically accurate. We are one in this space. But our English language makes it hard for us to grasp that and live in that reality. But we are given the social body as the space in which we can find our life. I just think that's a little creepy, but I think that's what we're invited. That's how God has made us, not individually.
Yeah. All right, Suzanne, he teed you up perfectly. I mean, Paul said a thing or two about being the body of Christ, right? Reflect a little bit on Paul's sense of what it means that we're the body.
So there's so many different ways that I could cut into that question. I think, when Paul's talking about the body in Corinthians and Romans, one point he is really underscoring is that whereas the social structure of his day assigns everybody a very clear place in a very stratified community, he doesn't deny that people kind of inhabit these different spaces, but he emphasizes that all are essential, right? So that's why this sort of assets-based, this leading causes of life stuff works just beautifully with Paul. His point is that we need one another. All of us need one another, and those in his context and perhaps in ours who are seen as the ones who have all the goodies actually need the ones who supposedly don't, because they actually do, right?
You reminded me, one time at the Carter Center, a church called me up and wanted me to come and speak. They actually invited Jimmy Carter and got me. Imagine their disappointment. But they wanted Jimmy Carter to come and be there on the Sunday they were going to honor the physicians and nurses. And so I said, sure, I'll come up and speak, but why them?
Yeah.
Why not have it be about the health of the community?
Right.
And why don't we honor everybody in the congregation, everybody connected to the congregation? What the heck? Everybody in the community whose life is advancing the life of somebody else. And the preacher hated this. He said, well, we wouldn't be able to fit them all in. I said, bingo.
Right.
That's the issue.
Right.
All of us are the part of the life of everybody else.
Right.
And if we program that way, the most significant agents of health is whoever's answering the phone for the church, who's ever looking for the kids.
Right.
It's the women's prayer group who knows everybody and prays for them. Right. It's the agent of healing is the whole.
Yeah.
And being connected, it seems, as a part of the body. I look around the room and I see there's a lot of parts. Yes, we're a whole, but I look around the room and I see all different kinds of skills and purpose and ways of being that are express itself. One of the things that we know is that having and knowing and finding purpose as an individual and an individual of faith in the world is life-saving. Say a little bit about the importance of purpose and being connected to it in this journey of life faith.
So I think the Chardonnay last night made this point feel better when we were talking about this. But the point we were making, in fact, I was reflecting, my wife, Dr. Teresa Kutch, is a clinical psychologist, and a few weeks ago, she insisted that I read a book, and I've learned that when she insists, I better read the book, by Johann Hari, H-A-R-I. It's called Lost Connections. And this is a journalist, who's an atheist journalist, who is reflecting on his lifespan of being treated for anxiety and depression, and reflecting on that. And we could go into the medical side of the story, and I urge you to read this because it's quite an extraordinary story, not of the failure of pharmaceuticals, but the way that our focus on pharmaceuticals distracts us from the actual answer, which he gradually finds his way towards. What the pathology, the pandemic of loneliness, and so many of us being on psych meds, really comes from our radical disconnection, and our anxiety and depression accelerates our distance from each other, and our healing is only found in how we are connected to the larger whole. And this can be quite intimate, to those we love the most and whose love we need the most. So his whole prognosis is we are sick and will get sicker if we don't create the structures that bind us together. Well, he's an atheist. I'm thinking, dude,
That'll preach.
we have several 100,000 of these structures that you would have to invent if we didn't already have them, called places of worship. And again, go back to Larry Pray, that if a church only had one source of life, it'd be connection, and that would do it all. But the healing of the community, I think, needs us to use what we already have, not to go, rent some medical help and put them over here in the building, but almost the opposite is to radically give our social connection away to those who need it the most. Now, it might creep them out too, like we did the breath thing, so don't tell them about that. But that's what we have is actually the answer of the radical pandemic of our time.
Which is loneliness.
Yeah. I mean, loneliness isn't in our head. It turns into biology instantly. And so many of the psychosocial, spiritual dynamics in us are pathological. They will turn into biology, and they will turn into all of the chronic behaviors and all of the chronic conditions. So much of this, the data and the logic and the science now, brings us right back into the fact that we are made to be together. That is how God made us. And when we are not together, we will be sick. We will absolutely be sick. And you can't treat it. You've got to reconnect.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to undercut the medical realities in which we live, because once you have these chronic conditions, you've got a chronic condition, and you gotta do it. But make sure your doctor doesn't think he's God. The God is the God that made us to be together.
So faith is not just in our head; it's in our biology as well, right?
I think the most poorly educated citizen of Sesotho would weep for us that we do not know that we are already made connected, and our attempt to connect something that God has already made connected is in and of itself tragic. So the health is not something we don't have. The health is something that is already alive in us. So these are causes of life. We're already alive. They're already in us. They're already moving. We just have to flows into you.
As I'm listening to you, I'm struck that for a long time, Christ Church has been striving to figure out ways to let life flow through it into the community. And we're never really separate from all those that call this place called Charlotte in many ways home. And that living and claiming of purpose, as many of you know, that we've been sort of talking about our vision for faith, connection, and well-being, is not something that will ever just be something related to what's here, showing up for church on Sunday, or joining our Bible study, or getting into a Zoom contemplation group, or coming from worship. Yes, that's about figuring out how individually and collectively to nurture the well-being and the connections that we all have here. But it is never, it is artificial for us to sort of imagine that sort of journey that we're all on is ever disconnected from the broader community within which we sit. And it strikes me that part of that aspiration of looking for life is figuring out how whenever I discover the life and I appreciate it, to then not to try to hold it for myself, right? But to figure out how to continue to release it into the community, into the ways that I...
Yeah, I think part of what we need from each other is people who will tune in to how we are describing our own life and listen to our language and correct it. I'm just going very concretely.
Yeah.
When I went to Memphis and found myself an accidental executive at a big-time hospital, one of the programs we had was because we were a Methodist hospital, we had a obligation and privilege to provide care for Methodist clergy, and a couple of hundred of them every year would come to the hospital for their annual physical, and I said, well, that's sort of an odd thing to call it. These are clergy; they believe. Why don't we call it a spiritual? And that's a more inclusive term.
Right.
But they came for the physical, and I went through it, and I realized right away, it actually wasn't a very good physical. It was kind of like a C+. I don't want to give anybody who's working for the church a C+ experience, so we're not going to do it anymore until we could be better than Mayo. And it turned out Mayo's like really efficient, but they're not very holistic. So we said, why don't we build this annual thing on leading causes of life? And the intervention, the most powerful part of the intervention, we did the same blood work, and we did all the same physical stuff. We asked all the chronic behavior kind of questions you'd ask in a physical, but all of the language was flipped. So it was all about life, not about what's trying to kill you. And instead of asking, what did your father die from? What did your mother die from? We said, what do you know about their life that informs your life? And so you found out how they died, but you also found out how they lived. And many, instead of just like putting liver, people would write a page or two, and it pulled them deeply into the actual complex narrative of their life and the life who came before them. And the end of this experience wasn't, okay, you need to walk more and you need to not eat so much sugar and fat, and here's a couple pills. The end of the experience was a debrief with a physician who themselves, we made sure, understood leading causes of life, and a life coach type person. I'm tripping over because we've now made disciplines out of what should be normal behavior. But my wife, TC, was sort of modeled this debrief. So it was a physician and someone who was really smart about the psychosocial, spiritual part of you. They were utterly together in helping you see your own life. That was the intervention. And then at one point we tried this. Well, I wonder what would happen. What if we brought a husband and wife together? What would that look like? What if we brought the loving couple together at the same time? And we thought, well, this is going to blow up some otherwise stable relationships. But the fact is, if you can be in intimate relationships with people who are seeing life in the same manner, life has a much better chance to emerge in that dyad, in that complexity in the family, in the church. So, but the intervention is the change in language. That's actually the most fundamental thing, is to change the way in which we talk about our life.
So I found out last night that you have a hobby that kind of relates to this theme that we're talking about, and that's that you're a beekeeper. Is that the appropriate way? You have bees. You have a hive or multiple hives.
They actually have me.
Okay, they have you.
So I describe myself as being kept by bees. And, they're about, I think right now, it's midwinter, but there are about 150,000 bees who have a claim on me. And I am in relationship to them, and they permit me to be part of how they find their life. And I'm writing about this because I think I'm a writer, and I think, bees have been honeybees successfully for about 30 million years, and we're not going to make 30 million. I'm not sure we're going to make 10,000. I'm not sure we're going to make another 200. So I find myself paying attention, and both Hebrew and Islamic scripture considers honeybees, second only to humans, as being in the image of God, which is pretty powerful. So I like lions and zebras and golden retrievers. But by scripture, if you're looking at where's the species where you can most see what God had in mind, you'd look to humans and honeybees, because both are profoundly social. And both of the species work when they're profoundly generous and generative. Honeybees are pretty cool. The male honeybees do not have stingers. And so probably millions of years ago, evolution decided, men really shouldn't be armed. It's just not going to work out. Well, think of the Charlotte newspapers today. If none of the men had access to any weapons, it'd be a smaller newspaper. But the women are armed. They rarely sting, and only in defense of the babies. And so the honeybees don't defend the honey. You can literally go in without gloves, take out the racks of honey, and you won't be stung if you don't freak them out. But they don't fight for the honey. They only fight for the babies. And every single characteristic of the hive is built to protect the babies and give them the chance. And I think God has made us in the same way, but we're not evolved as far, so we have all these other complicating, confusing traits. But I believe that's what God has in mind. Look out for the babies.
Look out for the babies. And the faith that vision of what can happen and what can literally flow through us into the world if we're willing to work together and to be concerned about the right things. Right?
Well, the interesting thing is honeybees seem to have been imprinted with these fundamental values and so they have teeny weeny little brains. Well, we have really big brains, but we don't seem to be imprinted. And so what is the part of the human phenomenon that reminds us of what we are for, of what our lives are for, what our ultimate purpose is? That's the spirit. And so I think we're not imprinted, but we have the capacity for, Kant would say, creative imagination. The Africans would say every single human being, just like every honeybee, has this life energy that will express. And our spirituality, our spirit, is to make sure that life energy is for the whole, not just individuals.
I'd like to ask you if you would close us with a prayer. I want to say thank you for being with us today. I hope that as you've listened to this conversation, that your imagination, your sense of abundance, your sense of what it means to be called by life is surfacing a whole new set of questions for you or curiosities for you, and that as you continue to make your way this winter and this spring through our life of faith here, that you will continue to be curious about the way that life already exists in you and the way in which the Spirit is continuing to call and to wake life up in you, so that together life can flow through us both individually and collectively into the world. Gary, will you close us with a prayer?
So during COVID, I thought, well, this is a good time to write a couple books. So the book that came out was a book of prayers. I was shocked. I'd never actually written prayers. And I'm a little bit terrified to read this one in the presence of a no-kidding Bible scholar. It's Jesus' prayer. Teach us to pray, they asked Jesus, expecting instructions. He had disappointed and annoyed, as usual. But 2,000 years, almost anybody can mumble along with a handful of phrases he offered. This is what he said, paraphrased from Matthew 6:7. God save me for the paraphrase. Mother, father, sister, brother, and friend, who makes everything sacred and all life possible, we ask only enough for this day. Release the burdens of yesterday as we release the debts of those we have burdened. Protect us from distraction and anything that is not of life. May this be. That's it. That's all he said. Amen.
Amen. Gary, thank you for being here.
You.
Suzanne, thank you for being here.
Thank you.